Hello, welcome to another episode of History in the Dark. I am your host, Darkness the Curse. And before we begin, as always, thank you so much to my generous patrons, my British rail critics, and of course, my underwater train finders. You are the reason why this content remains lost at sea. And today we are going to discuss a story, one of the most infamous stories actually, about a ship that was lost at sea. Some would almost call it a ghost ship in that regard, as it literally vanished without a trace. There's a lot of stories of ghost ships over the years, some of which are just made up because they're stories, but this is an instance where one actually did genuinely vanish. No one has any idea what happened to it. Seriously, not a clue. No one has a single shred of direct evidence explaining what in the world happened to this ship, and it wasn't like this was a small ship or independently owned. This was a US Navy vessel. This is the story of the USS Cyclops. The USS Cyclops, otherwise known as AC-4, was actually the second of the four Proteus-class colliers that were built for the United States Navy in the few years leading up to World War I. A collier, by the way, is basically a large bulk cargo ship. They were kind of designed for carrying coal, though they could carry other things as well. Naturally, the Cyclops was named after the Cyclops, the one-eyed giant from Greek mythology, and she was actually the second US Navy vessel to bear that name. She was built by William Cramp and Sons of Philadelphia, and launched on the 7th of May, 1910, finally commissioned on the 1st of May, 1917. The Proteus classes weren't the largest ships ever, but they weren't exactly small. The Cyclops displaced about 19,360 long tons. She had a length of 542 feet or 165 meters, a beam of 65 feet, 20 meters, a draft of 27 feet 8 inches, or 8.43 meters, and she could go at a speed of about 15 knots. That's 28 kilometers an hour or 17 miles per hour. Her official complement was 236 officers and enlisted men, though on the day she vanished, she was carrying more than that. You probably noticed that the date between her launching and her actually being commissioned are quite far apart, and there's a reason for that. She just wasn't officially commissioned. There wasn't a war going on. She was placed in service, though, on the 7th of November, 1910, and she operated with the Naval Auxiliary Service of the Atlantic Fleet, and she traveled all over the place in that general area. She was in the Baltic from May to July in 1911 to supply 2nd Division ships, and when she returned to Norfolk, Virginia from that, she operated on the East Coast from Newport, Rhode Island, into the Caribbean. When the United States occupied Veracruz in Mexico in 1914 and 1915, she coaled ships that were on patrol there, and received the thanks of the US State Department for cooperation in evacuating refugees. But we want to talk about the real big deal, which is World War I. That's when she disappeared, and it was pretty quick. Just a few days over a year, in fact, after America entered the war. Like I said, she was officially commissioned on the 1st of May, 1917, and she joined a convoy for Saint-Nazaire, France, in June of 1917. She completed that trip successfully and returned to the US by July, and with the exception of a voyage she took to Halifax and Nova Scotia, she served only along the East Coast until the 9th of January 1918, when she was assigned to the Naval Overseas Transportation Service. That's when she sailed to Brazil to help fuel up British ships in the South Atlantic. It was during the end of February and the beginning of March when she would be seen for the last time. She was assigned the job of carrying some manganese ore. Manganese is a brittle chemical element, and it's usually found in combination with iron. It's a transition metal that can be utilized for a lot of industrial purposes, but it's usually used for the production of stainless steel. That's actually what this was probably going to be for. Actually, with the war going on, industry was up. They needed materials, and manganese was a critical component in many of those materials. But she was already experiencing problems when she first left the harbor on the 16th of February 1918. For one thing, it was thought that she was overloaded. Not by a lot, but enough that her primsole line was actually underneath the water, which is not something that you want. They investigated this and showed that the ship had been loaded and secured properly, or at least that's what they said. Additionally, she was experiencing engine trouble. Her starboard engine had a cracked cylinder, and it wasn't operative in that condition. She could steam without it, though, It wasn't like she necessarily needed that extra engine, though it would have been nice. The Cyclops finally set out for Baltimore for real this time on the 4th of March, 1918, and that was the last time she was ever seen. There was a rumor that she was spotted by a molasses tanker, Amico, but the captain of that ship insisted that wasn't the case. Why people thought that they saw her on the 9th of March from the Amico is unknown. But combined with the captain's denial of it, the Amico was near Virginia at the time. The Cyclops being there on the 9th of March, when she wasn't even scheduled to be in Baltimore until the 13th, seemed really unlikely. So this was probably just something perpetuated by someone saying something dumb one time, and everyone repeating it forever. Either way, the Cyclops never arrived in Baltimore at all. And what's really creepy about it is that nothing was ever found of the ship. When a ship goes down, something is found of the ship. An empty lifeboat, a life jacket, a life preserver, a life ring, a floating piece of wood, something that was from the ship. But nothing at all was found from the Cyclops. Not a single bit of debris, no bodies, nothing. It was just gone, vanished without a trace. A search was conducted by the Navy to figure out what the heck had happened, but like I said, they never turned up anything. Not a single bit of this ship was ever seen again. Now, there's been a bunch of theories thrown out about what happened to her. And I'm gonna give you the rational ones, because I assure you there are plenty of ridiculous nonsense theories that orbit this particular disappearance, because she disappeared in the area of the Bermuda Triangle, which is an area that is commonly associated with mysterious disappearances. For one thing, a storm was reported through the Virginia Capes area on the 10th of March. If the Cyclops was there, that could have caused some issues. She would have been underpowered because of her inoperative engine, and if she was overloaded, that would only complicate things. But that wasn't the only explanation ever given. The investigation eventually pointed to the idea of a possible structural failure. See, the Proteus-class in general actually had a bit of a design flaw that was discovered later. Two of Cyclops' sisters, both the Proteus and the Nereus, also vanished at sea, though much later during World War II. Both of them were also transporting heavy loads of metallic ore, and they were in the same general area of the ocean. The flaw was that the I-beams that ran the length of the ship eroded over time due to the corrosive nature of some of the cargo they were carrying. If an I-beam had just straight up broken, which is possible, it would have effectively broken the ship's back. There were cases of ships actually splitting in two as a result of this, and it was estimated that if the Cyclops had hit a storm with 30 to 40 knot winds, that could have resulted in waves just far enough apart so as to leave the bow and the stern of the ship supported on the peaks of those waves, but not with the middle supported. That extra strain on that already weakened central area could have caused the ship to snap. And if a ship breaks in two like this, it could sink within minutes, possibly even seconds, depending on various things. But no distress signal was ever sent from the Cyclops, so whatever happened did happen quick. So this sounds pretty likely given what we know, which is not a lot. But this wasn't the only theory, like I said, as World War I was going on, and the immediate thought was, well, maybe the Germans sunk her. This is still thought to be really unlikely, for two reasons. Number one, the Germans having a U-boat all the way out in the Caribbean, it was not impossible, but it was not probable. And after the war, records were gone over on the German side to see if they had any knowledge of the Cyclops that they weren't giving out. Because when they were first asked during the war, they said they had no involvement with the ship's disappearance. Based on their records, it seemed like they might have been telling the truth. There were no records of the Cyclops being sunk by a German U-boat. Nor were there any records of the ship being handed over to the Germans by the captain. Because the captain of the Cyclops actually is relevant to the story, as there were many, many rumors about him. His name was Lieutenant Commander George W. Worley, though he wasn't born as such. He was actually born Johann Friedrich Wichmann in Sandstedt, Hanover, Germany, in 1862. Yes, he was born in Germany. He actually entered America by jumping ship in San Francisco in 1878. By 1898, he had changed his name to Worley to try to disassociate himself from being a foreigner. And he also owned and operated a saloon in San Francisco's Barbary Coast. By the early 1900s, he became qualified for the position of ship's master, and he had commanded several civilian merchant ships before. But based on accounts of crew that had served with him even prior to the Cyclops, Worley was a big old jerk. Like, that was one element that really came about. Apparently, Worley commonly brutalized his own crew over trivial mistakes, but he was still commissioned as lieutenant commander in the Naval Auxiliary Reserve on the 24th of February 1917 anyway. The Navy wouldn't actually know about his habits as a commander until after the disappearance of the Cyclops. He would commonly berate and curse officers and men for minor offenses, and at one point he even chased an ensign around the ship with a pistol. He was often seen as rather lazy. He was once spotted making his rounds on the ship dressed in long underwear and a derby hat. He also had a really nasty habit of letting inexperienced officers remain in charge of loading cargo onto the ship while he confined more experienced ones to their quarters. In fact, that's exactly what happened in Rio. An inexperienced man was assigned to oversee the loading of the manganese ore. And that ore is something that a collier ship was not actually designed to carry necessarily. It could have done it, but it was unusual. Even the experienced people on board the ship may have been unfamiliar with this particular ore and how it should be laid out in the safest way. But the most serious accusation against Worley had to do with his possible pro-German stance. After all, he was born in Germany, and given the war was against the Germans, it was thought that perhaps he may have had quite a bit of sympathy for the enemy. So much so that perhaps he could have handed over the Cyclops and her cargo to the Germans and defect to the other side. And this wasn't a completely radical thought to have. For one thing, it wouldn't be unheard of for someone to defect during a war. That happens a lot, actually, more often than you think. For two, all his friends and associates were either of German descent or were actually German. So even though he'd been living in America, he still obviously preferred to hang out with other Germans. But like I said, Germany's records don't actually have any information regarding the Cyclops at all, whether being sunk by a submarine or just handed over to them. There was nothing there. So even if Worley, in his own head, may have had some sympathies for the enemy, it doesn't look like he necessarily had anything to do with the loss of the Cyclops, at least with regards to intentionally handing the ship over. Now, if his inept nature as a captain had contributed to her being overloaded and possibly snapping her spine, that I could believe. But without finding her, that's not something that can be proven. Because even to this day, even now as I speak, no trace of this ship, her wreck, any piece of her, has ever been found. Like I said, two of her sister ships sank in rather eerily similar circumstances, both in 1941, less than a month apart, believe it or not. And our other sister, USS Jupiter, actually became a different ship that you all might be a little more familiar with. Jupiter was rebuilt into USS Langley. Yes, the first American aircraft carrier was a sister ship of the Cyclops. The Langley, like I said, was converted into a carrier, mostly for testing the concept of a carrier setup. But she did serve faithfully during that time, and she didn't wind up sinking due to any design issues. She was bombed by the Japanese during World War II, being hit 5 times. Her surviving crew members were rescued, and the Langley wound up being scuttled on the 27th of February 1942 to prevent her capture. But as for the Cyclops, zero trace of this ship has ever been found. Like I said, some people will tell you it was an interdimensional portal or aliens or some nonsense, but I don't do that here. We do actual history, and I have literally given you all the facts we have. There are plenty of more reasonable theories, which I've already talked about those, and as for where she remains, assuming she sank, which seems the most likely option, well, it could be anywhere between Brazil and Baltimore. So good luck with that. Someone else also had the theory that perhaps one of the reasons why her remains haven't even been found is that what if she sank in the Puerto Rican Trench? That's the deepest part of the Atlantic. If her hulk had gone down there, it would be nearly impossible to get down there with conventional equipment anyway. You'd need some specialized deep-sea diving equipment to even begin that investigation. But it's not necessarily a guarantee that's where she fell. She could have been anywhere, really. Just sitting and waiting. And until she's found, her mystery will stay a mystery. And with that, a special thank you to all my underwater train finders. Thomas Ward, Some Dude 267, Orange Glass, Royal Hudson 2860, Lord Hoth 444, Benjamin Owens, Panzer Kitsune 131-232, Mr. Blackrose, Master of None, Josh Johnson, Metal for Life Guy, Anzac A1, Arthur Roy, Alaric Jaspers, DM Tribal Typhoon, Tommy Rossini, Jack Carson's Railroad Videos, Ty Hammonds Jr., and Ohio Trucker 1. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.